What does a man whose empire is built on words do when he can't get a single one from his own son? Julian Croft was a name chiseled into the very bedrock of Manhattan. It was the gold leaf imprint on the spines of 1,000 bestsellers, the masthead on the nation's most influential newspaper, and the silent, omniscient force behind the cable news network that shaped political discourse. Croft Media was an leviathan of language, and Julian, at 54, was its undisputed king. His hair was the color of steel, his suits were tailored with architectural precision, and his voice could command the unwavering attention of a boardroom or a congressional committee. Yet in the vast, echoing silence of his own home, that voice was utterly powerless. The silence had begun 2 years prior, on a treacherous stretch of black ice on the Palisades Parkway. A single horrifying moment of physics and fate had claimed his wife, Eleanor, a woman whose laughter was the true soundtrack of their lives. It had also claimed the voice of his 9-year-old son, Elias. The boy had survived the crash physically unscathed, but the trauma had slammed a door deep inside him, locking his words away in a vault of impenetrable fear. The diagnosis was traumatic selective mutism. The result was a silence that consumed everything. Their home, a duplex penthouse overlooking Central Park, became a gallery of their shared grief. The air, once filled with Eleanor's vibrant energy and Elias's chatter, grew thin and sterile. Julian, a man who solved every problem with a strategy, a takeover, or a brilliantly worded memo, found himself facing an equation with no solution. He waged war on the silence with his checkbook. He hired the country's most renowned child psychologists, speech therapists, and trauma specialists. He filled Elias's room with the latest communication aids, tablets that spoke typed words, intricate picture exchange systems. But Elias regarded them with a profound and heartbreaking indifference. He would not type. He would not point. He simply existed, a small, silent ghost in a palace of words. Julian's interactions with his son became a series of excruciating failures. He would read to him from the morning paper, his voice booming with false cheer, only to be met with a vacant stare. He would ask questions. How was school, son? What did you learn? And the silence that answered was a judgment, a condemnation of his inadequacy. He saw in Elias's quiet gaze not just the reflection of his mother, but the reflection of Julian's own catastrophic failure to protect his family. And so, he retreated into the one world he could control, his work. Mergers were logical, contracts were binding. Language in business was a weapon he wielded with lethal precision. Fatherhood was a foreign tongue he could no longer speak. On a cold Thursday evening in November, a last-minute cancellation of a dinner with a senator left a gaping hole in Julian's meticulously planned schedule. The housekeeper was off. He found himself standing in the doorway of Elias's room. The boy was on the floor, meticulously arranging a set of wooden blocks into a complex city-like structure, his movements silent and deliberate. Elias! Julian's voice was too loud, too formal. We're going out for dinner. Elias didn't look up. He simply placed another block on his tower, his small hands steady. It was acceptance, not agreement. Julian chose a place he hadn't visited in years, a small, unassuming Tuscan restaurant in the West Village called La Lanterna. Eleanor had adored it. She'd said it was one of the few places in New York that felt honest. He wasn't sure if he was seeking comfort or punishment in its memory. The drive downtown was a study in silence, broken only by the hum of the Bentley's engine. Julian scrolled through stock market analyses on his phone, the screen's cold light carving sharp angles onto his face. Elias stared out the window, his reflection a pale, solemn mask sliding over the glittering city lights. La Lanterna was an oasis of warmth and noise, a jarring contrast to their silent apartment. The scent of garlic, rosemary, and roasting meat hung in the air. They were shown to a secluded booth in the back. Julian, by reflex, placed his phone face up on the crisp white linen. I'll order for you, he said, not as a question, but as a declaration. He ordered the veal saltimbocca for himself and a simple pasta pomodoro for Elias. When the food arrived, the familiar, quiet tension descended. Elias picked up his fork, but he didn't eat. He simply nudged the pasta around his plate, creating patterns in the red sauce. He was building another silent city. Julian felt a familiar surge of helpless frustration. "Elias, you have to eat," he said, his voice sharper than he intended. He hadn't looked up from his phone, where an urgent email chain regarding a hostile takeover bid in London demanded his attention. He was more comfortable with corporate warfare than the silent surrender happening across the table. He didn't see the way Elias's small shoulders slumped, the way the boy's eyes fixed on his plate as if it were an insurmountable mountain. But someone else saw it all. Across the room, Maya Lenko was expertly navigating the narrow space between tables, a tray laden with dishes balanced perfectly on one hand. At 22, she moved with an economy of motion that spoke of years in the service industry. Her dark hair was pulled back in a tight braid, and her eyes, a deep, warm brown, held a weariness that went beyond a long shift. They were the eyes of someone who carried the weight of more than just dinner plates. She was working a double, trying to get ahead of the rent on her small Queens apartment and the ever-increasing costs for the specialized care her grandmother required. Maya was a professional observer. It was the secret to being a good waitress. You learn to read the unspoken language of a table, the subtle tension of a first date, the easy rhythm of an old married couple, the boisterous joy of a celebration. She had clocked the man in the expensive suit and the silent boy the moment they walked in. She saw the father, radiating a cold, coiled power, his attention captured by the glowing screen in his hand. And she saw the boy, with his dark, serious eyes retreating so far into himself, he was practically disappearing. Her heart ached for him. That specific brand of loneliness was a language she understood intimately. She watched him push his pasta around, a silent, desperate act of defiance. She saw the father's brief, irritated glance before his attention returned to his phone. And then she saw something else. At a nearby table, a family of 4 was dining loudly. The father, a man with a booming voice and a garish watch, was holding court. His son, a boy about Elias's age, was complaining loudly about his steak. "I wanted the burger. You never get me what I want." The man laughed, then gestured vaguely towards Julian's table. "See that kid over there? At least you talk. Some kids are just broken, I guess. Probably not raised right." The words, though not shouted, cut through the restaurant's din like a shard of glass. Maya saw Elias flinch as if he'd been physically struck, his small body curled in on itself, his face awash with a shame so profound it was almost visible. Julian, hearing the remark, finally looked up, his face hardening into a mask of cold fury. He looked like he was about to rise, to unleash the full force of his power on this ignorant stranger. But then he stopped. He looked at Elias, saw his son's mortification, and seemed to realize that a public confrontation would only amplify the humiliation. He was trapped. The king of words was rendered speechless, unable to defend his own son. In that moment of parental paralysis, Maya felt a quiet, fierce resolve settle over her. She set her heavy tray down at a nearby station, took a deep, steadying breath, and began to walk toward their table. Maya approached the table with the quiet confidence of someone stepping into a situation she understood on a fundamental level. She didn't look at the loudmouth at the next table, nor did she immediately address the furious, paralyzed billionaire. Her entire being was focused on the small boy who was trying to fold himself into nothingness. She knelt, a gesture that was both practical and profound. It put her below Elias's eyeline, making her less of an authority figure and more of an ally. Her voice when she spoke was barely a whisper, a stark contrast to the clatter around them. "Hi," she began, a small, genuine smile touching her lips. "My name is Maya." That was a very loud, very silly man, wasn't it? Elias didn't respond, but his shoulders, which had been up around his ears, lowered by a fraction of an inch. Julian finally tore his glare from the other table, his focus shifting to this unexpected intrusion. "What do you think you're doing?" His voice was a low growl, laced with the steel of a man unaccustomed to being interrupted. "This is a private family matter." Maya met his stormy gaze for a brief second, a flicker of understanding in her eyes before turning her attention fully back to Elias. "No problem at all, sir," she said calmly. "I just know that sometimes, when the world gets too loud, it helps to have a secret language." As she spoke, she raised her hand near her own chest, out of the father's direct line of sight, but clearly visible to the boy. With deft, simple movements, she made the American Sign Language sign for breathe. Then she tapped her chin with her index finger, the sign for sad. She followed it with a questioning look. Elias stared at her hand, his eyes wide with a mixture of shock and confusion. No one had ever spoken to him in his own silent world before. After a long moment, he gave a tiny, almost imperceptible nod. He was sad. Julian watched, utterly baffled. He had no idea what the gesture meant, but he saw its effect on his son. It was as if this waitress had thrown a rope into the deep, dark well where Elias lived, and for the first time, the boy had reached for it. Maya smiled again, a warm, conspiratorial expression. She then made the sign for ignore, a quick flick of her thumb from her nose, aimed discreetly at the other table. She followed it with the sign for strong, making two fists and moving them forward with determination. Ignore, be strong. She then reached for the silver sugar caddy on the table. Without a word, she began to stack the sugar packets, one on top of the other, creating a precarious tower. Her movements were slow, deliberate. It was a game of focus, a tiny island of quiet concentration in the middle of a noisy room. After she placed the fourth packet, she looked at Elias and nudged the caddy slightly toward him, an invitation. For a moment, Elias hesitated. Then slowly, with a hand that trembled slightly, he reached out, took a sugar packet, and placed it on top of her tower. It wobbled but held. Julian sat in stunned silence. This waitress hadn't made a scene. She hadn't offered platitudes or pity. She had entered his son's silent world, validated his feelings without a single spoken word, and then given him a simple, tangible task to pull him back from the brink of his shame. She had built a bridge of silence and sugar packets. Elias and Maya continued the game, their focus absolute. The Loud family paid their check and left, oblivious to the quiet miracle that had just occurred. Elias and Maya managed to build a tower 10 packets high before it tumbled, scattering across the white tablecloth. Elias didn't smile, not exactly, but the tight, wounded knot in his brow had smoothed out. He looked up at Maya, and in his eyes there was a flicker of something Julian hadn't seen in 2 years, a spark of connection. Maya began to gather the packets, her work done. "You're a very good architect," she said softly. She then stood, her professional demeanor returning. "Can I get you anything else? Perhaps some dessert for the builder?" For the first time that night, Elias looked towards his father. He didn't speak, but he gave a single, decisive nod. Julian, his own voice hoarse, could only manage one word. "Yes." As Maya left to get the dessert menu, Julian looked at his son, who was now straightening the sugar packets into a neat line. He had just witnessed a masterclass in communication, and it had nothing to do with vocabulary or volume. It had to do with seeing, truly seeing, the person in front of you. He reached for his wallet, his mind already calculating. But as he looked at the crisp $100 bills, he had the strange and unsettling feeling that the real currency of what had just happened was something he didn't possess. When Maya returned and placed a slice of tiramisu in front of Elias, Julian pushed a stack of bills across the table. "For your exceptional service," he said, the words feeling clumsy and inadequate. Maya looked at the money, then at Julian, and finally at Elias, who was cautiously taking his first bite of dessert. A small, sad smile touched her lips. "That's not necessary, sir," she said, gently pushing the money back. "Watching him feel better was the only tip I needed." She gave Elias a small nod. "Enjoy the victory." And with that, she was gone, disappearing back into the choreographed chaos of the restaurant. Julian Croft sat there, the rejected money a stark symbol of his own limitations. He had offered a transaction for what was clearly an act of grace. He looked at his son, who was now eating his dessert with a quiet focus, and for the first time since the accident, the silence between them didn't feel like an accusation. It felt like a question. He had a problem that his entire empire of words couldn't solve, and he was beginning to suspect he had just met the answer. But the answer worked for tips and lived in a world he couldn't comprehend. He was determined to change that. The following morning, the formidable machine of Croft Media was discreetly retooled for a singular purpose: to learn everything there was to know about Maya Alenko. Julian did not become a titan of industry by acting on sentiment. The awe and humility he'd felt in the restaurant had, by dawn, crystallized into a strategic imperative. Emotion was a variable. Information was a constant. He summoned Marcus Garrison, his head of security and corporate intelligence. Garrison was a man who seemed to exist in the spaces between moments, silent, unobtrusive, and ruthlessly effective. A former CIA analyst, he now handled the sensitive operations that kept Julian's corporate and personal worlds insulated and secure. His job was to know things. They met in Julian's office, a cavernous space on the 50th floor, with a view that swallowed half of Manhattan. The city was laid out below them like a map, a kingdom Julian had conquered. "A name," Julian began, foregoing any preamble as he stood before the floor-to-ceiling window. "Maya Alenko, works at La Lanterna in the village." Garrison, standing by the massive mahogany desk, made a small note in a leather-bound book. He didn't ask why. "I want a complete profile," Julian continued, his back still to the room. "Address, financials, family, education, personal history. I want to know her debts, her dreams, her pressures. I want to understand what makes her tick." "But Garrison," he turned, his gaze sharp as honed steel, "your presence must be a ghost. No ripples. She cannot know she's being observed. Understood?" "Perfectly, Mr. Croft," Garrison replied, his voice a dry rustle of paper. "Discretion is the architecture of information. Timeline? 24 hours. For the next day, Garrison's network of invisible feelers stretched out across the city. They were not hackers or thugs. They were masters of the public record, of digital footprints, of conversations held under carefully constructed pretexts. They spoke to former landlords, nursing home administrators, and old community college professors. They pieced together the mosaic of a life lived on the knife's edge of responsibility. The dossier that lay on Julian's desk the next morning was thin, but its contents were heavy. Subject: Alenko, Maya. Age: in 22. Address: 3rd floor walk-up, Astoria, Queens. Rent: 20 hours, 100 month. Currently 4 days past due. Financials: checking account balance, $142.58. Savings account, $31.12. Outstanding debt, $12,800, mix of credit card and personal loans. Family: parents deceased, industrial accident, age 16. One living relative, maternal grandmother, Sophia Nowak, age 78, resident of St. Jude's Elder Care Facility, the Bronx. Health: Sophia Nowak. Advanced dementia requiring specialized memory care. Costs exceed Social Security and small pension by approximately $1,500 a month. Subject covers the shortfall. Education: Queensborough Community College, major in social work. Dropped out after 3 semesters. Reason: grandmother's deteriorating health required her to work full-time. GPA 3.9. Skills notable: fluent in American Sign Language, ASL. File note from QCC Disability Services indicates she volunteered as a translator for a deaf classmate for 2 years. This classmate, in an informal follow-up, referred to her as the most patient person I've ever known. Employment: waitress at La Lanterna, 18 months. Prior, a series of restaurant and cafe jobs. Employment record is flawless, consistently praised for her calm demeanor under pressure. Personal: no social media presence, no criminal record, no outstanding warrants. The manager at St. Jude's described her as devoted, noting she visits her grandmother 3 times a week, every week without fail, even though Mrs. Nowak rarely recognizes her. Julian read the report twice, then a 3rd time. A cold, uncomfortable knot formed in his gut. This was not the profile of a hustler. It was the biography of a quiet hero, a young woman orphaned at 16 who had sacrificed her own education and future to care for the only family she had left. A woman drowning in debt, yet who had refused a handful of cash because decency couldn't be bought. The line about her ASL fluency resonated with the force of a thunderclap. It hadn't been a random, lucky guess in the restaurant. It had been a skill, a language of empathy she had taken the time to learn for someone else. She had seen his son's silence, not as an absence, but as a language in itself. He thought of the hundreds of thousands of dollars he had spent on therapists who tried to force words out of Elias, and here was a waitress who had created a meaningful connection by embracing the silence. The file answered all his tactical questions, but it posed a much larger, more difficult strategic one. What could he possibly offer a person who, with nothing, possessed the one thing his billions couldn't buy? His mind, conditioned to the logic of acquisitions and mergers, began to formulate a new kind of proposal. It couldn't be charity. The report made it clear her pride and principles were her only real assets. It had to be a contract, a position, a transaction that solved a critical problem for both of them. He needed a bridge to his son. She desperately needed a lifeline. He picked up his phone, bypassing his assistant, and called La Lanterna directly. "I'd like a table for 2 for tonight," he said, "and I'd like to make a specific request. I need to ensure my server is Maya Alenko. It's a matter of some importance." He was done gathering intelligence. It was time to make an offer. The clatter of the subway was a familiar, jarring soundtrack to Maya's exhaustion. Her body ached, her mind a frantic abacus of bills and obligations. The call from the administrator at St. Jude's had been polite but firm. The account was nearly a full month behind, and if it wasn't rectified, they'd have to discuss alternative arrangements for her grandmother. The phrase hung in the air like a guillotine. The memory of the silent boy and his powerful father felt like a strange dream from another life, a brief, puzzling interlude in her relentless reality. When she arrived at La Lanterna for her shift, the manager, Sal, intercepted her. "Alenko, booth 4, the big shot from the other night. He's here and he's asking for you." Maya's stomach tightened. A specific request from a man like that could only mean trouble. She smoothed her apron, took a deep breath, and walked toward the back booth. It was them. Julian Croft sat opposite his son, Elias. There was no phone on the table this time. His focus was entirely on her as she approached, an intense, analytical gaze that seemed to peel back her professional veneer and see the raw fatigue beneath. "Good evening," Maya said, her voice steady despite the flutter of anxiety in her chest. She made a point of looking at the boy first. "It's good to see you again, Elias." Elias's head turned toward her voice. He gave her a small, solemn nod of recognition. "We will not be dining tonight, Miss Alenko," Julian stated. His tone was not unkind, but it was absolute. He gestured to the empty seat beside Elias. "Please sit. I would like to have a conversation. I have already cleared it with your manager, and you will be compensated for your entire shift." This was so far outside the bounds of restaurant protocol that Maya could only stare. But a quick glance showed Sal frantically nodding his approval from across the dining room. Hesitantly, she slid into the booth. The plush leather felt alien. "My name is Julian Croft," he said formally. "This is my son, Elias. Maya Alenko. It's nice to meet you both properly," she replied, her mind racing. "Ms. Alenko," Julian began, leaning forward slightly, "I am a man who values directness. What I saw you do 2 nights ago, it was the most effective piece of communication I have witnessed in years." Maya felt a flush of heat rise to her cheeks. "I was just trying to help. That man was being a jerk." "You did more than help," Julian corrected. "You understood. My son has not spoken a word in 2 years, since the accident that took his mother. I have hired the best minds in the country. They have all failed. You, in under 2 minutes, succeeded." He paused, letting the statement hang in the air. "I have read your file. I know about your grandmother. I know about your time at Queensboro and your fluency in ASL." Maya froze, a cold dread washing over her. "My file? I do not make investments without due diligence," he said unapologetically. "And I am here tonight to offer you a job, a position. I want you to be Elias's companion, his translator." The word hung in the air. Maya was completely floored. "A translator? He doesn't—" "He does," Julian interrupted. "He speaks in silence, in gestures, in the things he builds and the patterns he makes. It's a language none of us have bothered to learn. You seem to be the only native speaker. I want you to teach him, and I want you to teach me." He laid out the terms with the cool precision of a corporate lawyer. The job would be to spend 5 hours a day with Elias, from 3 until 8, Monday through Friday. Her role would be to engage him, to build on the connection she had already forged, to create a bridge of communication between him and the world, and between him and his father. Then he slid a heavy, cream-colored envelope across the table. That is the proposed salary paid weekly. It is, I assure you, significantly more than you make here. Maya's hands trembled as she opened it. The number inside wasn't just a salary, it was a rescue. It was her grandmother's safety. It was the end of late notices and the constant, grinding fear. It was a winning lottery ticket, and it scared her to death. "Why me?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "You could hire a specialist, someone with a PhD. "I have," Julian said, a hint of bitterness in his voice. "They all see him as a problem to be solved, a pathology. You saw a sad little boy being bullied. Your primary qualification, Miss Alenko, is not on your resume. It is your character. It's a commodity I've found to be in desperately short supply." Maya looked at Elias. He had been listening, his dark eyes fixed on her face. He reached out a small hand, not to touch her, but just placing it on the table near her arm, a gesture of quiet appeal. That small gesture shattered her reservations. She looked at the number in the envelope, a figure that meant survival. Then she looked at the lonely face of the boy beside her. The money was a necessity, but his silent plea was the reason. How could she refuse? Yet a lifetime of caution wouldn't be erased by a single offer, no matter how generous. "On a trial basis," she said, her voice finding a surprising strength. "1 month. We see if this is a good fit for Elias. His well-being is the only thing that matters." A flicker of respect appeared in Julian Croft's eyes. He had come expecting desperation and had found dignity instead. He had laid a trap of salvation, and she was calmly negotiating the terms of her surrender. 1 month, he agreed with a crisp nod. "You'll begin Monday. A car will be sent for you. My office will handle the contract and your resignation here." The meeting was concluded. He stood and Elias stood with him. As they prepared to leave, Maya spoke one last time. "Mr. Croft," he turned. "There's one rule," she said, her gaze steady and unwavering. "When I am with Elias and you are with us, the phone stays in your pocket. Off." For the second time in their brief acquaintance, Julian Croft was at a loss for words. He stared at her, this young woman who was simultaneously accepting his lifeline and dictating the terms of his own behavior. He gave a single, sharp nod of agreement, then turned and guided his son out of the restaurant, leaving Maya alone in the booth, the envelope a heavy weight in her hands. The roar of the restaurant faded. Her life had just been acquired by Croft Media, and she wasn't sure if she was the corporation's greatest new asset or its most vulnerable liability. The Croft penthouse was an architectural marvel of glass, steel, and silence. It was less a home than a private museum where the sole exhibit was meticulously curated emptiness. The art on the walls was famous and forlorn, the furniture was beautiful and untouched, and the view of Central Park was a breathtaking landscape that seemed to mock the lack of life within. On her first day, Maya's simple cloth tote bag felt like a piece of contraband in the sterile perfection of the foyer. The housekeeper, a woman named Mrs. Davies with a posture as rigid as her tightly pinned bun, eyed Maya's worn sneakers with undisguised contempt. But Elias was there, waiting just beyond the threshold, and his face held a look of quiet anticipation that was all the welcome Maya needed. "Hi, Elias," Maya said, her voice warm in the cool air. "Ready to get to work?" He nodded, leading her not to a playroom or a study, but to the vast, formal living room. It was a space designed to impress, not to be lived in, with a white sofa that looked like it had never been sat on, and a grand piano that gleamed under the track lighting. "First lesson," Maya announced, setting her bag down. "We're going to make this place a little less quiet." She hadn't come armed with flashcards or therapy tools. She had brought a large sketch pad and a set of charcoal pencils. She sat on the floor, crossing her legs, and gestured for him to join her. Hesitantly, he did. "Okay," she said, looking at him directly. "I know words are loud, I get it. So today we're going to talk without them." She opened the sketch pad. "I want you to show me what your day at school was like. Not what you did, what it felt like." She handed him a piece of charcoal. For 20 minutes he just stared at the blank page. Maya didn't push. She simply sat with him in the silence, her presence a calm, steady anchor. Then slowly, Elias began to draw. He didn't draw people or desks. He drew a series of frantic, jagged lines, a chaotic scribble that filled one side of the page. On the other side, he drew a small, perfect circle, enclosed inside a thick, dark square. He pointed to the jagged lines, then to his head. Then he pointed to the circle in the box, and then to himself. Noise outside, quiet inside. Maya nodded, a lump forming in her throat. "I see," she whispered, and she did. In a few simple lines, he had explained his entire existence. She then took her own piece of charcoal. She drew a picture of a flower with its petals tightly closed. Then she drew the sun next to it. She pointed at the flower. "You!" Then she pointed at the sun and gave him a questioning look. "What makes you open?" He thought for a long moment, then took the charcoal and drew a series of musical notes next to the flower. Julian came home that evening to a sight that made him stop dead in the archway of his living room. His son and the waitress were sitting on his priceless Persian rug, a large sketch pad between them, their hands and faces smudged with black charcoal. The room was still silent, but it was a different kind of silence. It wasn't empty. It was full of conversation. He didn't speak. He just watched as Elias drew something, and Maya responded with a drawing of her own, a silent, eloquent dialogue unfolding on the paper. For the first time, he wasn't looking at a son who was broken, but at a son who was speaking a language he simply hadn't known how to listen to. Maya's sessions became the center of Elias's world. They communicated through drawings, through ASL, which he picked up with astonishing speed, and through music. They sat at the grand piano, and Maya taught him how to translate feelings into chords, major chords for happy things, minor chords for sad ones. Soon Elias was composing his own simple, haunting melodies, his small fingers finding the notes his voice could not. Slowly, cautiously, Julian was drawn into their silent world. He kept his promise about the phone. He would come home and sit, at first on the edge of the pristine white sofa, and just watch. Maya would include him, signing a question and then looking at him to provide the answer, which he would then translate for Elias. "Elias wants to know what the best part of your day was," she would sign, and then say aloud to Julian. I closed the Henderson deal," he'd say, the words sounding hollow and meaningless in this new context. Maya would translate, and Elias would respond with a flurry of signs. "He says," Maya translated back, a small smile on her face, "that a deal sounds like a very loud, jagged line." Julian looked at his son, who was watching him with an unnerving intensity. He thought about the screaming matches, the threats, the brutal negotiations. A jagged line. It was the most astute business analysis he'd heard in years. One evening, he came home to find them in the kitchen. Maya was teaching Elias how to make Eleanor's favorite biscotti. The air was filled with the scent of anise and almond. Julian stood in the doorway, a ghost in his own memory. Elias saw him and signed, his hands moving with newfound confidence. "He wants you to help," Maya said softly. "He says his grandmother, your wife, told him you were always the best at cracking the eggs." The statement was a gut punch of love and memory. Before he could retreat, Maya was handing him an egg in a bowl. And so, Julian Croft, a man who commanded a global media empire, stood in his kitchen with flour on the sleeve of his custom suit and cracked eggs for his son's biscotti. He was clumsy. He got shell in the batter. But when Elias, seeing his father's mistake, made the sign for laugh, a wide smile drawn in the air with his index fingers, Julian felt a genuine laugh bubble up from his own chest. It was a foreign sound, rusty from disuse, but it was real. The penthouse began to transform. A charcoal drawing of a flower slowly opening was framed and hung in the foyer. The lopsided results of their baking experiments sat on the marble counter. The house was no longer a silent mausoleum. It was starting to have a soul. But as this fragile new ecosystem began to thrive, it did not go unnoticed. And in the cold, clear heights of the Croft Media Tower, a predator was watching. Her name was Victoria Thorne, and she was the chief operating officer of Croft Media. Sharp, ambitious, and utterly ruthless, she had been Julian's protege, his corporate sword arm, for over a decade. She respected his killer instinct, the very qualities she saw being diluted by this newfound domesticity. She saw the change in him, the softening of his eyes, the distraction in board meetings, the way he now left the office at 5 o'clock sharp. She saw it all as a liability, a weakness that could jeopardize the massive, hostile takeover of a rival network that she had been orchestrating for months. Victoria viewed Elias as a tragic but unfortunate variable. She viewed Maya as a virus, a common blue-collar girl who had somehow breached the walls and was infecting the king with dangerous sentimentality. She knew that to get the old Julian back, the shark she needed to close the deal, she had to eliminate the source of the infection. And Victoria Thorne did not play defense. She attacked. Victoria Thorne's methods were as precise and devastating as a surgical strike. She wouldn't resort to something as clumsy as planting a piece of jewelry. Her battlefield was corporate, her weapons were contracts, shell corporations, and the brutal impersonal logic of the bottom line. She had Garrison's original file on Maya Alenko pulled from the server, and in it, she found her ammunition, St. Jude's Elder Care Facility. Digging deeper, her corporate intelligence team discovered that St. Jude's, a small, independent nonprofit, was struggling. Their building was old, their fundraising was down, and they were precariously over-leveraged on a loan from a small regional bank. A bank that, as it happened, had recently been acquired by a much larger financial institution with whom Croft Media had a very close relationship. Victoria made a phone call, then another. Within a week, the terms of St. Jude's loan were abruptly called in for risk reassessment. The small nursing home was suddenly facing a catastrophic, multi-million-dollar balloon payment they had no hope of making. The alternative was foreclosure. The final venomous touch was the identity of the potential buyer in the foreclosure sale. A real estate holding company called Park Avenue Ventures. It was a subsidiary so deep in the Croft Media portfolio, so utterly obscure, that Julian himself had likely forgotten it existed. But its name was no accident. Victoria waited for the inevitable panic to reach Maya, which it did in the form of a tearful, desperate phone call from the St. Jude's administrator. Maya was devastated. She spent 2 days making frantic calls trying to find a lawyer, an advocate, anyone who could help. She found only closed doors. Finally, her face pale with dread and defeat, she knew she had to do the one thing she had sworn she would never do: ask Julian for help. She approached him that evening in his home office, a place she had never before entered. "Mr. Croft," "Julian," she began, her voice trembling, "I'm so sorry to ask you this. I wouldn't, but I have nowhere else to turn." She explained the situation, the sudden demand for payment, the threat of foreclosure that would put her grandmother and dozens of other vulnerable residents on the street. "I don't know what to do," she finished, her voice breaking. "It feels like someone is doing this on purpose." Julian listened, his face a mask of concern and quiet anger. "This is unconscionable," he said, his voice low. "Don't worry, Maya, I'll take care of this. I'll make some calls. We'll find out who is behind this and we will stop them." This was exactly what Victoria had been counting on. The next afternoon, she requested an urgent, unscheduled meeting with Julian in his corporate office. She entered carrying a slim, leather-bound folder. Her face was a perfect portrait of grave concern. "Julian, we have a problem," she said, her tone serious. "A significant one. It's about the Alenko girl." Julian leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing. "Go on." "I was running a standard risk assessment analysis in preparation for the final push on the ACN merger," she began, her words chosen with practiced ease. "It involves reviewing all personal and financial entanglements. Something flagged. It seems Ms. Alenko has been accessing information she shouldn't be." She opened the folder. Inside were network access logs. They showed that Maya's personal laptop, using the guest Wi-Fi at the penthouse, had been used to search the Croft Media internal database for real estate holdings, specifically looking for subsidiaries involved in property acquisition in the Bronx. "She's been researching us, Julian," Victoria said, her voice dripping with disappointment. "And then, this morning, I was informed of a potential conflict of interest. A nursing home called St. Jude's is being acquired by one of our own subsidiaries, Park Avenue Ventures. A routine, profitable acquisition. And who is suddenly trying to get you to intervene and kill the deal? Maya Alenko, the The nursing home where her own grandmother lives. She let the pieces hang in the air, a perfectly constructed mosaic of deceit. Julian, she played you. She saw the file on Elias, targeted him, got into your house, and is now using her influence over you and your son to manipulate you into solving her family's financial problems at the expense of this company. This isn't kindness. It's the most sophisticated corporate infiltration I've ever seen. She's a grifter, and she's a damn good one. The cold, cynical poison seeped into Julian's mind. The searches, the convenient timing, the appeal to his emotions, his old, distrustful self, the one that had built his empire, roared to the surface. He had allowed himself to be soft, to trust. And this was the price. The warmth he'd felt, the connection with his son. Was it all just a calculated illusion? The betrayal was a shard of ice in his gut. He stormed home, the leather folder clutched in his hand like a weapon. He found Maya and Elias in the living room, sitting at the piano, working out a new melody. The scene of domestic tranquility that would have warmed his heart yesterday now looked like a carefully staged deception. Maya. His voice was the whip crack of a commander. Maya and Elias both flinched. The music stopped. It was the voice of Mr. Croft, the billionaire, not Julian, the father. My office, now, he commanded. To Elias he said, go to your room. Elias looked from his father's thunderous face to Maya's bewildered one. He shook his head, his hands balling into fists. He signed frantically, no, stay, safe. Elias, now! Julian roared. Terrified, Elias finally retreated, but he stood just outside the living room, hidden in the shadows of the hallway, listening. In the office, Julian threw the folder onto his desk. Explain this, he snarled, his voice vibrating with rage. You've been playing me, using my son, using his condition, to get close to me so you could fix your family's pathetic financial mess. Maya stared at him, the color draining from her face as the accusation, in all its venomous absurdity, sank in. She looked at the logs, at the name Park Avenue Ventures, and the trap sprang shut around her. She saw it. She saw how it looked. No, she whispered, her voice trembling. Julian, I would never. You have to believe me. Believe you? He scoffed, his laugh a harsh, bitter sound. I believe what I see. A woman with debt, a problem, and a sudden, convenient access to a man who can solve it. You are a liar and a user, and you have endangered my son. The sheer injustice of it broke through her fear. Tears of anger and hurt welled in her eyes, but her spine straightened. This was not the man who had cracked eggs in the kitchen. This was a stranger. You're wrong, she said, her voice quiet but ringing with a sudden, steely clarity. You are so wrong. But you want to believe this, don't you? It's easier. It's easier to believe in betrayal than it is to believe in simple kindness. It's the logic of your world. Everyone has an angle. Everyone is a shark. She took a step closer, her gaze unwavering. But you know what? You taught me something, Mr. Croft. You taught me to look for patterns, and this pattern is too neat, too perfect. A forgotten subsidiary with a name like Park Avenue Ventures? A loan called in at the perfect time? This isn't my pattern. This is a corporate hit. It's clean. It's brutal. It smells like Victoria Thorne. Her words, turning his own cold logic back on him, struck him like a physical blow. He stared at her, this waitress who was now dissecting his own COO's strategy with terrifying precision. You need to leave, he said, the words heavy, but the fire in his eyes had been replaced by a flicker of doubt. Your employment is terminated. A car is waiting for you downstairs. I know, she said softly. The fight went out of her, replaced by a profound sadness. But before I go, you need to understand what you're doing. You aren't just firing a grifter. You are telling your son that the one person who learned his language is not to be trusted. You are putting him back in that silent box, and you are locking the door yourself. For him, this won't be a firing. It will be a disappearance, just like his mother. She turned and walked out of the office. In the hallway, she saw Elias, his small face streaked with silent tears. She knelt and hugged him fiercely. She signed one last thing against his small back. Be strong. I am proud of you." Then she stood, walked to the front door without a backward glance and left. The heavy door clicked shut, and the silence that rushed in to fill the void was absolute, crushing, and final. Julian Croft stood alone in his monument to words, having just made the most catastrophic miscalculation of his life. He had won the argument and lost everything that mattered. The silence that Maya's departure left behind was a physical presence, a thick, suffocating blanket that smothered all life in the penthouse. Elias retreated completely. He wouldn't come out of his room, not even for meals. The charcoal drawings were turned to the wall. The piano remained closed. He had not just lost his friend, he had watched his father, his protector, cast her out. The message was clear: trust is a trap, and connection is temporary. Julian was adrift in a sea of his own making. Maya's final words haunted him. "You are putting him back in that silent box, and you are locking the door yourself." He wandered the vast, empty rooms, the silence accusing him, judging him. He saw the half-finished batch of biscotti on the kitchen counter, now stale. He saw the smudges of charcoal still visible on the leg of the piano. They were artifacts from a happier world, a world he had willingly destroyed based on a folder of evidence and a lifetime of cynicism. He saw her face, not pleading, but analyzing. "This isn't my pattern. It's a corporate hit. It smells like Victoria Thorne." The doubt she had planted began to grow, strangling his self-righteous anger. Victoria's presentation had been too perfect, too cinematic. It played directly to his worst fears and his basest instincts. He sat at his desk, pulled up the files on Park Avenue Ventures, and began to dig, this time not as an accuser, but as the investigative journalist he had once been, long before he became a king. He didn't just look at the data, he looked for the story. He found that Park Avenue Ventures had been dormant for 6 years until 3 weeks ago. He saw that its board had been reconstituted with 2 of Victoria's most loyal lieutenants. He cross-referenced the acquisition of the regional bank that held St. Jude's loan. The deal had been pushed through with unusual speed, personally overseen by Victoria, who had cited a unique strategic opportunity. It was all there, a trail of breadcrumbs leading directly back to her. She hadn't just presented him with a situation, she had manufactured the entire crisis from start to finish. She had weaponized his own company against an innocent woman to secure her deal. The realization hit him with the force of physical nausea. He had been played not by the waitress, but by his own second-in-command. He had sacrificed Maya's dignity and his son's fragile happiness for a lie. His rage, when it finally came, was cold, quiet, and absolute. He summoned Victoria to his home office that evening. She arrived confident and triumphant, expecting to be praised. "The ACN deal is ready for your signature, Julian," she said, placing a thick document on his desk. "We won." Julian didn't look at the document. He looked at her, his eyes like chips of granite. "Tell me about Park Avenue Ventures, Victoria." A flicker of surprise, quickly masked, crossed her face. "A minor real estate holding. Profitable. And its recent interest in a nonprofit called St. Jude's?" he asked, his voice dangerously soft. "A sound investment. The land is undervalued," she said, her corporate armor firmly in place. "It was a brilliant move, Victoria," Julian said, standing and walking to the window. "Sophisticated. Ruthless. The kind of move I would have admired once. You identified a threat to an objective, analyzed her weakness, and neutralized her using the enemy's own resources. Textbook." He turned back to face her. "But you made one critical error in your calculation. You assumed the objective was the ACN deal. You were wrong. The objective was my son. You targeted my family to win a business deal. You tried to turn me back into the man I was 2 months ago, and for that, you cannot be forgiven." He pressed a button on his intercom. "Garrison, please escort Ms. Thorne from the building. Her access is revoked. Have her office cleared by morning." Victoria's face went white with shock and fury. "Julian, you can't do this. I built this deal. I built half this company with you. And now you will be compensated for your shares and you will leave," Julian said, his voice flat and final. "You taught me a valuable lesson, Victoria. Always protect your most valuable asset, and you are no longer it." After she was gone, there was no triumph, only the deep, hollow ache of his own culpability. Firing Victoria was easy. Rebuilding what he had shattered would be infinitely harder. He didn't send a car or summon her to him. He drove himself to Astoria, Queens. He found her building, a worn-out pre-war walk-up, and climbed the 3 flights of creaking stairs. The air smelled of garlic and lemon-scented cleaner, the smell of real life. He knocked on her door, his heart pounding with a fear he hadn't felt since his first hostile takeover bid. Maya opened the door. Her eyes were tired and swollen, but when she saw him, there was no anger, only a bone-deep weariness. "Mr. Croft," she said, her voice devoid of emotion. "Maya," he began, the name feeling unfamiliar and heavy on his tongue. I know everything. I know what Victoria did. There is no excuse for my behavior. I was a fool. I broke my own rule. I let someone else's narrative override the truth that was right in front of my eyes. I am more sorry than I can possibly say." He handed her a thick envelope. "This is not a severance. It's restitution. Inside is the deed to the St. Jude's building. I bought it. The title is being transferred to a new nonprofit foundation. Its board will be made up of the residents' families. It will never be threatened again. There is also a cashier's check. It is not payment for your pain, which I know is priceless, but it is an attempt to undo the financial damage this has caused you. It is enough to take care of your grandmother and to allow you to go back to school." Maya stared at the envelope, her mind unable to process the scale of his apology. It was an apology written in the language of a billionaire, an apology of assets and acquisitions. "And Elias?" she finally whispered, her voice thick. "How is he?" "He's lost," Julian said, the confession tearing at him. "And I don't know how to find him. I broke his trust. He needs you, Maya. I have no right to ask you for anything, but I am asking, not for me, for him. Please come back, not as an employee, as a friend, as a teacher. You taught him how to speak again. Now I need you to teach me how to listen." Maya looked past this powerful, broken man, down the dingy hallway of her own life of struggle. Then she looked at the envelope in her hand, a symbol of a future free from fear. But the image that burned brightest in her mind was of Elias, alone in his room, surrounded by a silence she knew all too well. A slow, tired smile touched her lips. "I have a condition." Julian held his breath. "Anything." "The 3 of us," she said. "We're going to the kitchen, and we are going to finish making that batch of biscotti. Together." A wave of relief so profound it felt like a physical blow washed over Julian Croft. A genuine smile, the first in what felt like a lifetime, reached his eyes. "It's a deal." The Croft penthouse was never the same. It was slowly, intentionally filled with life. The silence was replaced by the sound of Elias's fingers on the piano keys, no longer haunting, but hopeful. Maya returned, not to the old arrangement, but to a new one, as a consultant for the newly established Eleanor Croft Foundation for Communicative Arts, an organization Julian founded to fund programs that used art and music to help nonverbal children. She finished her degree in social work, her tuition paid for by a man who now understood that the best investments had nothing to do with money. Julian learned to communicate. He learned to sit in silence and listen to a drawing. He learned to understand the story told in a minor chord. He learned the ASL signs for father, son, and eventually family. One afternoon, nearly a year later, the 3 of them were in Central Park. Elias was sketching the twisting branches of an old oak tree. A tourist, seeing the boy's intense focus and silence, remarked to his wife, "It's a shame that poor boy can't talk." Before Julian could react with his old bristling anger, Elias looked up from his sketch pad. He looked directly at the man, and with a voice that was quiet, a little hoarse from disuse but perfectly clear, he said, "I can. I just have better things to do." He then looked at his father and Maya, and a brilliant, radiant smile spread across his face. It was his first spoken sentence in 3 years. Julian felt tears well in his eyes. He looked at Maya, whose own eyes were shining. He had thought his world was built of words, but he was wrong. It was built of connection, and the architect of it all was a waitress who had seen a sad little boy and had been brave enough to kneel and speak his language. Together, the billionaire who had everything, the boy who had found his voice, and the waitress who had given them both a new language, had built a masterpiece far greater than any corporate empire. A family finally at peace.